Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Bourke. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. This is a fascinating episode that I recorded a few weeks ago at the GLOBSEC conference in Prague. Now, regular subscribers to my Substack, Latika Takes, and those of you who are regular listeners to the podcast know and understand that I have simply not had an opportunity to release this episode until now. But I'm actually kind of pleased with the delay because the subject of this interview has only become more topical and progressed since recording. So I feel a little vindicated that I identified this subject when I did. I'm super pleased to introduce my guest today. His name is Jim Stokes, formerly, although technically still of the Pentagon. He's worked in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Naval Special Warfare Command, and the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. These days, you find him in Brussels at NATO. He is Director of NATO's Nuclear Policy. Since we recorded this episode, we've seen some significant developments in this space. The UK and France formally pledged to cooperate on their nuclear deterrent. And as you'll hear in this interview, this is significant because France does not offer its nuclear deterrent to NATO. And we've also seen the UK announce that it will acquire, or as Jim Stokes so rightfully points out, restore an air leg of delivering nuclear weapons. I'm very grateful to NATO and to Jim Stokes for the time they gave me in the middle of what was a super busy GLOBSEC conference for us all. Let's get into it. I began this interview by asking Jim to explain his role at NATO.
So I work for the International Staff, which is part of the organization that was established many decades ago to support how the allies of the NATO come together to make decisions. And my job specifically is as the Director of Nuclear Policy. So in my office, my team and I oversee all aspects of NATO nuclear deterrence, policy, plans, posture, everything. And we do that through different types of committee work that then goes up to the Nuclear Planning Group, which is our decision-making body at the level of the defense ministers that comes together in peacetime or even in a crisis or conflict situation to make any and all decisions for NATO with regards to anything about our nuclear forces.
And so your role, like SECUR, which is the Supreme Allied Commander of European troops, is always held by an American, is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at least historically, when I've looked at my predecessors, I mean, they've all been Americans, and there's probably a variety of reasons for that. But it may also relate to the fact that since 1954, the United States has had its nuclear weapons forward deployed within Europe, a variety of different scales and in different postures. They've been there for many decades now. And the fact that SACEUR has always been an American, I think it might relate to the fact that it does deal with our nuclear weapons, which also deals with our command and control. And this is an important thing because it's perhaps not well understood outside of NATO, but our decision-making process is, on one hand, it is by consensus. It's how the allies can come together, both two nuclear powers, the United States and the United Kingdom, and now 29 non-nuclear weapon states, and how, as a part of a nuclear alliance, we come together to talk about these things and make decisions together. However, it is also important to note that per the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, we have 5 recognized nuclear powers, and they have to maintain control over their nuclear weapons. So for the United States and the United Kingdom, and also for France, albeit separately from the Nuclear Planning Group, they have to maintain absolute control over their nuclear weapons. And so we distinguish that there's a clear understanding that there isn't a misinterpretation of what we're doing at NATO. When we talk about nuclear sharing, we're really sharing the burden of that political decision-making. We share in the operational risks if we ever have to conduct a mission. We share in the financial costs, but the United States is not sharing its nuclear weapons with non-nuclear weapon states. That would be in violation of its NPT obligations. So, there's a lot of misinformation that's out there about these issues, and so we have to talk about it to kind of clarify what exactly do we do. And it's a little hard because a lot of our work is classified, but we are trying to be more transparent about how it works inside NATO.
So how does this nuclear umbrella work exactly? We hear a lot about this talk, but I'm not convinced everybody necessarily knows exactly how it operates.
Yeah, there is a lot of discussion about the nuclear umbrella. We don't refer to it like that. I think that's more in the The open domain, only because, I mean, it's kind of funny. I don't understand how the umbrella concept came about, but it's also important because we are facing a lot of criticism from other countries, to include Russia and China and others, who say that our non-nuclear allies, again, 29 allies within NATO who do not have nuclear weapons, that they are somehow in a third category of states. Also, Japan, South Korea, perhaps even Australia, countries that benefit from extended nuclear deterrence. And some nations are saying that there is a third category underneath the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that's absolutely not true. So we don't really refer to as a nuclear umbrella. What we do refer to is we are part of a nuclear alliance. And what we have are collective decision-making processes. We have ways of coming together to make decisions in peacetime about policies, plans, posture, modernizing our capabilities, etc. And then we have mechanisms where, in a crisis or conflict situation, we can make very specific decisions about potentially using our nuclear forces in different ways. And that's really what we're coming together to do at NATO through the Nuclear Planning Group. That's where we spend a lot of time focusing on the political decision-making process, because we don't have any decisions that are made by the military. They make recommendations to political authorities, and then they make those decisions at a political level that then is communicated down to the military in terms of a set of orders that they would go off and execute.
So in a hypothetical situation where NATO decides the time has come and it must use a nuclear weapon, how would that play out? It's Britain and the US who have these nuclear weapons, and we'll get to why France doesn't operate its nuclear weapons under the auspices of NATO in a bit. But how physically would these nuclear weapons be deployed? What are the range of options? And let's just, for this very hypothetical war game situation, consider it's Russia.
Okay. Well, the United States and the United Kingdom and France all have what we would call strategic nuclear forces. They manage those somewhat independently, if you will. It's a national responsibility that they have. So for the United States, it has intercontinental ballistic missiles. It has strategic bombers based in the United States, and then submarine-launched ballistic missiles on its ballistic missile submarines. And so within the alliance, we say that our strategic nuclear forces are the ultimate guarantee. So it's sort of the backstop of our security, and that all 32 nations can rely on those three nuclear powers to be able to employ their nuclear weapons in a way that would provide for our security. Within what we're talking about at NATO, in our headquarters, about NATO nuclear deterrence, it's a subset of that, if you will. Our nuclear forces refer to dual capable aircraft that are provided by several nations. They're based in Europe, and those nations that provide those aircraft also provide pilots that are trained and they're certified for a nuclear mission. So our decisions are first going to focus on those dual capable aircraft, and then they're complemented by U.S. nuclear weapons that are forward deployed in Europe, which again fall underneath the U.S. command and control that goes all the way up to the U.S. president.
Do we know where they're deployed, or do you keep that secret?
I know where they're deployed, and yes, that is
So
classified.
I can't know.
No, the only thing that we ever acknowledge is that they're in Europe.
Okay.
But we don't ever acknowledge, we don't confirm or deny the presence or the location or the numbers of any nuclear weapons in Europe.
Sure. Would you ever do what Vladimir Putin seemed to do, which was when he was threatening, and he has threatened many times during his invasion of Ukraine, to use a tactical nuclear weapon? Would you ever move those weapons around in a show to demonstrate the deterrent effect of having them in Europe?
I don't know that we would consider an option like that. Again, when you're trying to think about how you can have a deterrent effect, you're trying to affect the calculus of an adversary. So it's thinking. So it's about sending a signal, and also accompanied by a message, ensuring that that is received and then interpreted correctly. So anything that we might do, any message we might deploy, any signal, like say movement of aircraft or changing of readiness levels or something like that, we'd have to ensure that that would be very carefully decided. Would it be appropriate for the moment? How would we complement that with a particular type of message if we need to do that? And then would that be appropriate? And then would it have the intended effect? So there's a lot that kind of goes into that. To get back to your earlier question, though, about how does it work for the U.S. and the U.K. weapons. So when we're looking at all the aspects of using NATO nuclear forces, it really does involve around those aircraft that I mentioned, and then the U.S. nuclear weapons that are here within Europe. And then again, we have the ability to go to the United States and the United Kingdom if we ever need to. They have additional capabilities that they could also bring to bear. Now, France, you brought up France earlier, and France is separate from the Nuclear Planning Group by choice. Again, no problem with that, of course.
Okay.
Every nation decides to participate in the alliance in different ways, and even including with nuclear deterrence. So even though France is separate from our decision-making process and its nuclear forces are kept separate from NATO, we do believe that it contributes to our overall security. And that it's really, I think, complicated for Russia to understand how it all works on the other side of the fence, if you will. You've got NATO and our decision-making process. You have 3 different nuclear powers that can operate independently based on decisions made by the US president, the French president, or the UK prime minister. And then there's other things that happen within the alliance. There's bilateral relationships, there's multilateral activities. And to be honest, any adversary has to keep track of all of those things. And I think those are very additive to each other. And sometimes people are wondering if, some of the statements made by President Macron recently, is it trying to pull the allies away because the U.S. is disengaging? I think a lot of that's just wild speculation. If anything, what I see is our 3 nuclear powers are looking at ways to strengthen nuclear deterrence in different ways. I think our non-nuclear allies within Europe and also, how Canada contributes are looking at ways that they can strengthen nuclear deterrence through non-nuclear capabilities that they're investing in, through public statements, through raising the nuclear IQ, as we call it. So how do we talk about these issues publicly to be able to counter a lot of the fear that Russia is trying to sow across the alliance through disinformation and threatening to attack the alliance, all this rhetoric that they're using. So if anything, I think we're in a really strong position right now. We're looking at ways to continue to strengthen nuclear deterrence so that if we get into that worst case scenario, we can actually make the decisions that we need to. Because we're an alliance of democracies, we need to have public support for what we're doing. We've seen through polling that we've done for years, even preceding the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we have high levels of support. There's a high level of public trust in NATO to act responsibly as a nuclear alliance, certainly compared to what Russia's been doing.
Of course. So you brought up 2 things there. One was disengagement. It does, for all intents and purposes, look like the United States under Trump wants to disengage. Now, it's on a spectrum. We could have a debate about that, but it does look like they want to disengage from Europe. They don't want to be the security guarantor of Europe anymore. So is there a world where NATO can effectively defend itself at this nuclear level without the United States?
Well, I don't actually think we need to even explore that hypothesis at all because from my perspective, again, and I'm benefiting from some inside baseball, as you will, I think the United States has been extremely clear that its extended nuclear deterrent commitment has not changed. And I think that's been clear, and some public statements have been made, and certainly been clear behind closed doors in Brussels and elsewhere. We're not sensing that there's going to be any sort of changes to our posture from a negative perspective. I don't think it's anything about withdrawal or disengagement. I think, if anything, we should be looking at options at how to further strengthen what we've been doing for quite a few years now to really sort of bolster our posture within Europe. I think a lot of this is more related to the ongoing discussion we're having in the alliance about the balance of effort across the alliance, across the European nations, in the United States and Canada in terms of conventional defense capabilities. And I think this is all a good conversation to have. Perhaps it's not an easy one, but it's absolutely important. We agreed back in 2014 that allies should be spending 2% of GDP on defense. Now we recognize that it needs to be higher than that amount so that we can provide the military forces we need to defend ourselves, to be able to implement the plans that SACEUR has developed. So we know we need to spend more. We've been talking about this for over a decade now, and I think we're on a very good path to see that. That's also important because those conventional military forces, once they are fielded, they support nuclear deterrence because we need them to operate together. So if we're looking at our mission, if it's ever executed, we need a lot of conventional capabilities, which provides ways for all these other allies who don't have nuclear weapons, and we don't need them to have nuclear weapons, to actually participate in a mission, to be able to support nuclear deterrence, to participate in our exercises in ways that are palatable for them from a political perspective. Everyone's got a domestic public opinion. They've got different political sensitivities. They find ways to sort of fit into what we're doing with the nuclear deterrence. And that's really where the unity comes in, that they all feel like they're a part of that process and they can contribute in different ways.
So I hear what you say about the nuclear deterrent not fundamentally changing under Trump, and I do hear that point. I think it's fair and valid to say he's never really talked about withdrawing the nuclear deterrent. That's true. But it does relate to Article 5, which is this idea that an attack on one is an attack on all. I think it's a little less studied part of that clause that says it's then up to member states to decide how to operate and react. But Article 5 at its premise is the deterrent factor of NATO. So aren't these two concepts interlinked? And if you see President Trump undermine in any way, or anyone, by the way, undermine in any way Article 5, aren't they thereby, if you are the nuclear deterrent, also undermining the nuclear deterrent aspect?
Well, there's certainly a way to look at the worst case scenario there. I think we can point back to 76 years in NATO's history and see that no nation state has ever attacked the alliance. In my mind, I think that is because our deterrence is held overall, and I think that's because it's been backed by nuclear deterrence. There's always been a lot of questions about different leaders and what they would do or not do in some hypothetical situation, some war with the Soviet Union or a war with Russia. I think the best thing we can do is let's find a way to avoid that situation in the first place. And I think the best way we can do that is to increase our defensive capabilities, to make sure that they're backed by nuclear deterrence, to make sure we have the political will to use our capabilities, and then we talk about it. Because when we do that, then we will be countering any sort of misperception that we are weak. I don't think the alliance is weak right now. I think we're in a very strong position. I think the Russians are cautious. They don't want to actually get into a war with NATO. I don't think that they want to risk that.
Although the head of German intelligence said they believe, or they have evidence to show that they think Russia is ready to test NATO. Doesn't mean a tank over a border like in Ukraine that we saw, but they're ready to test NATO.
Well, I think that they are certainly willing to do certain types of activities. I think we've seen an uptick in so-called hybrid attacks, cyber attacks, things like that, in a way that maybe they haven't done that as much in the past. Mm-hmm. But that's different from an act of armed aggression against the alliance, which would be, there's no clear trigger for an Article 5 situation. Everything is, of course, up to the allies to determine how to respond to any situation.
Well, famously, 9/11 is the only time it's ever been triggered. And
that's right.
That was a terrorist attack on US soil.
Exactly. So what we always strive for at NATO is flexibility in our strategy. We need flexibility in our politics so that we can come together. Again, now at 32 sovereign nations, it's a lot of countries to come together to make consensus decisions. But once we do, they are absolutely ironclad. So I think, yes, what we've seen is that the Russians are certainly engaging in certain types of destabilization activities. They're doing things that are sort of not below the level of an Article 5 situation, but they're doing things to perhaps probe and test a little bit. We still sense that there's a little bit of caution there. I mean, I don't think that they're willing to start a full-scale war with NATO at this point. But there are certain things where they are probing and testing. And again, if you read through Russian doctrine and military thinking, they fundamentally think about this thing different. They don't think of peace and war as being sort of binary. I mean, they approach this as they are in some sort of a stage of conflict already. They see this as there already is some sort of a war between the West and Russia, including through the war that they're prosecuting in Ukraine. And so I think they have a fundamentally different way of looking at this. Longstanding Soviet military strategy and even in Russian military strategy, I think they're looking at this as preparing the operational environment, if you will, in case there is a higher scale conflict. And so what we need to do is understand what are the Russians doing and why, and to be able to counter that so that they're not disruptive to our societies, they're not interfering with our elections, they're not conducting cyber attacks or anything like that. It's just we need to find a way to be able to counter a lot of that malicious activity. And then if it escalates in any sort of way, or if we get into a crisis situation, know how we can handle those situations.
So we're recording this podcast at GLOBSEC in beautiful Prague. And on the panel that I saw you speak, there was a very good point made about how the United States actions, and notwithstanding all the things you've said about believing that the United States remains firm on NATO, could cause Putin to miscalculate. And we do see this in history. Wars are often not started intentionally. And you say Putin at the moment, the thinking is he doesn't want to start one intentionally. He might make a mistake and start one, right? Isn't that the danger with what the White House has been saying about NATO?
I think it's certainly a possibility. I mean, again, I don't know that anybody has a good read on any world leader. I mean, it's always possible they can make different decisions at different points in time based on information they're being provided, the stress of a crisis situation. I mean, it's really kind of an unknowable thing. I mean, even after the fact, I mean, historians will go back and try to understand why did leaders make certain decisions, and it's a difficult thing to understand. But I think the good thing that comes from that is there's always an element of caution, I think, because you don't actually know how the other side is going to react. So certainly the Russians have gone into this full-scale war in Ukraine. They've been operating in Ukraine for over 11 years now. I think a lot of people have looked at this and said that they perhaps miscalculated that maybe they thought it would be an easier war than it has been. Maybe they've had to alter their political objectives or their overall strategy. Maybe they didn't think that the West would respond the way that it has. I think there should be a little bit of an element of there is some uncertainty, there is some chance that's involved, and hence there should be an element of caution before you engage in any sort of military conflict. And I think that that can be a good thing, and perhaps that's why between NATO and the Soviet Union and NATO and Russia now and in other places around the world, the choice typically tends to be let's not engage in military conflict and maybe see if there are alternative ways to achieve our security objectives without going into a war because you don't know how it's going to play out.
Would we win a war against Russia?
Well, I think that it would depend. I mean, I'm not one to predict how a war would play out, but I think when we would think about a conflict with Russia, there's perhaps 3 points to keep in mind. One, it wouldn't look like it's war against Ukraine right now. It would be fundamentally different, even according to their nuclear doctrine. They would see a war with NATO as being different from what they call a localized war in Ukraine. So there's some important lessons I think we can learn from Ukraine, and we are talking with them and looking at how they're innovating on the battlefield. But a war between NATO and Russia could be in different domains. It could be more in the maritime domain, more in the air domain, space, cyber. And obviously, it would pull in the nuclear domain as well, because Russia has nuclear weapons and we're a nuclear alliance. That would also be perhaps the first time in recorded history you have two nuclear powers or a nuclear alliance on one side and a nuclear power on the other going to war with each other. So it'd be a different situation. We don't have a lot of military history we can reflect on to see how that would play out. So would we win or not? I think it would probably depend on if the conflict can be contained below the nuclear threshold. I do think that the Russians would probably try to play with that threshold a little bit. They would try to intimidate us. They would threaten to use their nuclear weapons.
Well, famously, they've done this all the way through the campaign in Ukraine.
Exactly. Lots of rhetoric, perhaps posturing. But would they actually cross the threshold? I don't know. If it's just kept at a conventional level, it would probably maybe be in our advantage at some point in time. I mean, we have 32 nations, the size of our economies, the number of personnel that we could put in the field. It would very much depend on when that war would be fought. Are you talking about something that's a year from now or 20 years from now, 40 years from now? I mean, the time factor
I
is
think I'm
relevant.
talking in the short term because it comes against the context of us now hastily rearming, as you mentioned, scrambling to meet these defense spending targets that were agreed as far back as a decade ago. And we've all been so slow. Have we been too late, I guess, is really the question.
Well, I think that we are still in a peacetime environment right now. So trying to build up conventional military forces through spending, it's one thing to do that in peacetime. And I think we've seen in history, in a wartime situation, I mean, economies can be sort of supercharged and defense industries can be supercharged. So I think it'd be a different situation there. And I think NATO has a tremendous amount of buying power that we would be able to marshal. But to get back to the other part of your question, what happens if you cross that nuclear threshold? Obviously, we would never want to see that situation because neither side would necessarily know how that war would play out. So I think it's inherently an unanswerable question, who would win the war? And this is why, going back to Reagan and Gorbachev, and other leaders have repeated this, a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. And the P5 leaders came together in January 21 and said that again, because everybody understands that, one, we've never seen a nuclear war actually fought before. We don't know how that would play out. And with the number of nuclear weapons that are in the world, it could be a very bad day for everybody in the world. And we don't want to see that. We don't ever want to see a nuclear conflict break out. And to be honest, we don't want to see a war break out at all. So I think the best thing is to have an element of caution and to be able to not pursue any sort of risky behavior or anything that could be escalatory.
Okay, this leads very nicely to my next question, or next set of questions. There's a huge amount of people, particularly in the region from where I'm from, that would say the best response or best solution to all of this is everybody get rid of their nuclear weapons. Why aren't we doing that? And what's the rationale? And two, you talked about strengthening nuclear. So this is the other side of that same coin. What does that look like in NATO right now? And what is the United Kingdom's particular role in strengthening its nuclear deterrent? Is that building up more nuclear warheads? Is that diversifying the ways it could deploy a nuclear weapon?
Well, I certainly appreciate the sentiment of a lot of people see that there's no utility in nuclear weapons. And NATO has said repeatedly for many years now that we do seek a world where there are no nuclear weapons. The problem is, how do you actually get there? Right? It'd be easy for us to unilaterally disarm. But if we did that, we would be causing harm to our own security because we're faced by other nations who are not willing to get rid of their nuclear weapons. They're not willing to disarm. And certainly when we're faced with the threat from Russia, and this isn't like the Russia of the 1990s or the 2000s or even the 2010s. This is the Russia that's willing to basically tear up the UN Charter, invade other nations, brutal wars not only against Ukraine, but other things it's done against Georgia and other states. We need to look at what's in our best interest in order to be able to provide for our security. And we fundamentally believe that if you're potentially going to get into a conflict with a nuclear-armed adversary, you need to be nuclear-armed yourself. We don't do it for warfighting purposes. We're not thinking about it like that. We're thinking about it for deterrence purposes, which means we want to be able to have the capabilities to defend ourselves, of course, and to be able to affect the thinking of that adversary, of the Russians, so they don't miscalculate and they don't think that they could get away with some sort of a risky situation where they could start a war and be able to win that. And so the best thing for us is to be able to have our own nuclear capabilities. So
they're wasting their time.
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of nations continue to look at arms control measures, risk reduction measures. Of course, we don't want to see further proliferation of nuclear weapons to any other state because our allies, all 32 of them, are part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and firmly committed to that. But this thought, the ban treaty that's out there, and people can advocate for we should just all get rid of nuclear weapons. Well, how is that going to work in China? They're on track right now to triple the number of nuclear weapons they have. How's that going to work for Russia? I don't sense that in Russia that they're willing to get rid of their nuclear weapons. If we could actually pursue arms control with these nations, as the U.S. has proposed, that could actually be to our advantage. But I don't sense that they've been willing to do that, at least not based on their past track record. Perhaps it's coming around. So it would be good if we can get to a point where there are less nuclear weapons and we can eventually get to a world where we don't have them at all. But
that ain't happening.
I don't think it's going to happen anytime in the near term. And for us, we certainly need to look at our overall sets of capabilities, our posture, and everything that goes into that and make sure that it is effective so that we're not actually going to be potentially threatened by another adversary and how they could use them.
So if strengthening the nuclear deterrent within NATO now doesn't involve allowing more NATO countries to acquire nuclear weapons, Poland is a good example here. They've actually talked about expanding NATO's nuclear remit. One, why are you so adamant that a country like Poland, for example, couldn't have nuclear weapons?
Well, it's not that they can't have nuclear weapons, but if any nation is a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, then they've agreed that they will not receive nuclear weapons, they will not develop their own nuclear weapons.
Things change. I mean, the world is a scary place and Poland's on the border with Russia.
That's true. I mean, there are certainly some people who have speculated, should their nation have a nuclear weapons capability? I look at that and say, well, one, if you're part of a nuclear alliance or somehow benefit from extended nuclear deterrence in the United States, then perhaps you don't need to do that. And we've been pretty clear that the way that we have nuclear sharing arrangements within NATO, the way that we've constructed the nuclear alliance, it actually is inhibited any sort of desire. It's disincentivized nations from pursuing their own nuclear weapons. And in fact, to go back a little bit into history, the Soviets even knew about this. They knew how we were constructing the nuclear alliance. They were worried about further proliferation to other countries, to include West Germany, who may have had an interest, going back to the early 1960s. And the Soviets had an interest in working with the United States to come up with Articles 1 and 2 in the Non-Proliferation Treaty so that we wouldn't see further proliferation. There were projections at that time there could be 25 or 30 nations that could have nuclear weapons by basically where we are today. And we haven't seen that, right? We have 5 recognized nuclear weapon states and reportedly 4 other countries that have nuclear weapons now. And thankfully, no other nation has crossed that. So would a country like, well, not to name any names, but would they really want to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, spend an exorbitant amount of money to develop nuclear weapons and delivery systems and doctrine and decision-making processes and how would that fare against whoever their potential adversary would be? I don't know that it's a really wise course of action to look at that. I think what would be better and cheaper and faster and more secure is to double down on what they currently have. So if you're part of a nuclear alliance like NATO, or if you're in a bilateral alliance with the United States, focus on how you can work with that nuclear power to be able to achieve your security objectives, how you can contribute to nuclear deterrence without necessarily having to have your own nuclear weapons.
So this puts a lot more on the shoulders of Britain, doesn't it?
I think so. From my perspective, it has been a little bit interesting over the last 6 months that there's been a lot of focus on both the United States and France, and yet the United Kingdom is our third nuclear power within the alliance, and there's been less discussion about that. I do think, since you mentioned the Strategic Defense Review, that could change going forward. I was encouraged to see the document when it came out. There was a lot of mention of nuclear in there, both the threats that are coming from Russia, but also how the United Kingdom is reinvesting in its own nuclear capabilities. The United Kingdom dedicated its nuclear forces to the defense of NATO in 1962, so for quite a long time now. I think it has high levels of credibility. I mean, it is going to be there to support the alliance, much in the same way the United States has for a long time. It's highly capable platforms, and it is contributing those forces and future forces, right? The investment that comes into that to support NATO nuclear deterrence for decades to come. So I think that it's really encouraging. Perhaps it doesn't make as many headlines, if you will, but it's really important what the United Kingdom does to reassure the allies to talk about nuclear issues with our non-nuclear states. I know that there's a lot of bilateral conversations that also happen between our three nuclear powers in different countries to talk through these issues and help them have a better understanding of nuclear deterrence. And this is a really positive thing. We work really closely with the United Kingdom, and they contribute a lot of different ways inside the alliance that I think we really benefit from.
So there was a report as a result of their big defence review that suggested they could look at deploying nuclear weapons from aircraft as opposed to just submarines, their current capability. Is that something NATO would support?
I think that if the United Kingdom making a national decision about its nuclear deterrent, and if there are additional options that it's providing, yes, I think that would be very much welcome. The UK used to have an air leg, if you will. It used to have air deployed weapons that it discontinued back in, I think, 1998, because it didn't see at that time that it was really necessary anymore. If it reconstituted that or made some changes to its sea leg, its submarine-based force, I mean, I think all that's going to be welcome, because it's additive to everything that we might be able to potentially utilize within NATO. And I think that would then strengthen our overall sets of capabilities. But it's also the political factor of this, right? Because you're public about it. You're going to be spending money. Politicians need to talk about it. The public will know about it. And hence, everyone else around the world sees that we are strengthening deterrence rather than the opposite, which is we're walking away from it, or we're shying away from it, or we don't want to talk about it. And I think, again, that does have a deterrent effect, because a potential adversary is going to see what we're doing and see that we're not actually shy about our nuclear deterrence. If anything, we're being more vocal about it. And I think that is a way of sort of reinforcing the political will that we have, not just to invest in these capabilities, to exercise them, to operate them, but also to potentially use them if we need to.
Why is China building up its nuclear stockpiles?
Well, there's a variety of different viewpoints on that. I mean, part of it could be China wants to see itself continue to rise and be a great power on the world stage, if you will. And some people think that China is pursuing a nuclear expansion just to be able to support that. I think other people are saying that China may be expanding its nuclear arsenal so that it's roughly on par with the United States in terms of deployed strategic warheads, and that may give it some leverage if it ever tries to do anything vis-a-vis Taiwan. There could be a variety of other reasons that go into that. China's got an economy that can support it. It's expanding its conventional military forces. Perhaps it makes sense that it would expand its nuclear forces as well. I think the key thing that we're certainly concerned about is if it's on pace to triple its nuclear arsenal within now a decade from now, which would be roughly at parity with where the United States and Russia currently are in terms of deployed strategic warheads, one that does present a deterrence challenge to the United States and all of its allies in terms of how do you potentially deter conflict in two regions and perhaps simultaneously in the Indo-Pacific region and also the Euro-Atlantic region. So there's a lot of people who are talking about what that two nuclear fear challenge would look like. I think it's a bit more complicated than that, but that's certainly an aspect of it. What we don't know is China is building up, but China is also very opaque. They have a no first use policy, which basically says that we won't use nuclear weapons unless somebody uses nuclear weapons against China first.
Do we have that?
No, we do not have a no first use policy. Neither the United States, United Kingdom, or France, and neither does NATO. I don't think it's very credible to say something like that. I think the Chinese get a lot of.
Wait, so do you believe them when they say they have
No. I mean, I believe that they have it written down somewhere. But ultimately, I believe that decision making is made by the Chinese president. So I don't know that any leader is going to feel beholden to some doctrine that's written down somewhere. I think they're going to make decisions, perhaps in a crisis situation or even a conflict situation, based on the advice that they're given, based on their own beliefs. There's a lot more that goes into that. They're not going to pull some document off the shelf and say, what did it say? What did Chairman Mao talk about back in the 1960s? So I think that they tried to use that to promote the fact that their nuclear deterrent is peaceful, but then they're using it to obfuscate the fact that they're also building up. So there's a lot of criticism of the West, and the US, UK, and France in particular. Why are you all maintaining a nuclear stockpile? Why aren't you disarming? And then we point to China, and then everybody gives them a pass on this and say,
yeah, I have interviewed people in the disarmament space and asked them this. They trot around to all the Western governments and I say, well, how much access do you have in Russia and China? Oh, never spoken to them. Of course, they don't let us in. Well,
yeah, and China has no interest in arms control. They've never engaged in bilateral nuclear arms control, even risk reduction measures, hotlines, anything like that. I mean, I think there's a lot more that we could do with China if they had it in their interest, but they've shown that they're clearly not willing to do that. They just talk about their no first use policy as if that's sufficient. But even their policy, their no first use doctrine, has a couple loopholes in it, if you will, where there are some exceptions that could be made. I don't want to rely on something that they've written down. I want to have a better understanding of why are they investing in certain capabilities? What are the concepts that go behind that? What is the political purpose of these things? Are they potentially going to try to use them coercively? Are they looking at how Russia has fought its war against Ukraine to include all this nuclear rhetoric, to include using dual capable missiles, although with conventional warheads? Is there some sort of a benefit from using your nuclear power coercively? I don't know if that's how they see that, but I mean, would that be possible in a potential conflict over Taiwan? It remains to be seen. But
so do we assess that they would use a nuclear weapon in Taiwan, or we assess that they would threaten, like Russia has with Ukraine, and that we would self-deter as a result, because that's exactly what we did with Ukraine for a long time?
Well, I do think that the Chinese do approach nuclear doctrine a little bit different from Russia. We certainly haven't seen that they're willing to threaten to use nuclear weapons the way that the Russians have.
Yes. In fact, Xi Jinping, I'm pretty sure, was instrumental in getting Vladimir Putin to retreat from some of his nuclear threatening rhetoric. There was a point in time, I think, where I think the US put that out there.
He's certainly been given some credit for that. Yeah. I don't know one way or the other, but he's certainly been given some credit for that. But I do think that it is somewhat of a divergence in the philosophy, if you will, between China and Russia about nuclear weapons. And the Russians are trying to derive some sort of benefit from this sort of coercive use, whereas China, I think, does not necessarily engage in that type of rhetoric. They're not willing to sort of do that. I think that they have more of a view of using nuclear weapons for deterrence purposes, and that they're trying to deter an attack against the Chinese homeland. But that buildup, though, and the diversity of weapons and the delivery systems, and why? What is that really for? What is the ultimate motive behind all that? There is some sort of a political decision that was made. There are some goals. There are some military objectives. There are reasons why states invest in different capabilities. And China is investing a lot in its nuclear arsenal, not just modernizing its capabilities, but expanding the number of warheads. The world has seen this. Non-governmental organizations have pointed to this, and the newspapers are writing about this. It's not like this is some exquisite intelligence information, right? The world knows that China is building up, and they haven't come clear on why they're doing that. They won't even admit that they're doing that.
So what should a country like Australia do in that context?
Well, I think that continuing to have a dialogue with other partners in the Indo-Pacific region is absolutely vital. I think it's very valuable that at NATO we have what we call the IP4, right? So our four Indo-Pacific partners of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, that we have a dialogue across our different regions about the security challenges that we see, because our regions are linked to each other. They're not separate from each other. They're linked economically. They're linked from a security perspective. We share common values and interests, and we all have different security challenges that we're dealing with. So it's important we talk with each other, even though we come from different regions, to figure out how can we support each other? How can we show political will and how we have friendly relations between the different nations and how we can tackle some of these really hard deterrence and defense challenges that we face.
Well, talking is nice, but that's not going to do much.
No, it's a start though. Our relationship with our Indo-Pacific partners is relatively nascent. The alliance structure we have in the Indo-Pacific region between the United States and its allies goes back for decades though. So I would say for Australia, while it's good to have dialogue with other Indo-Pacific nations and European nations, other nations from around the world, talk to the United States, continue to cultivate that bilateral relationship there. And if it's a discussion about nuclear issues, that's the power that you should be talking to, is engaging with the United States and have an understanding of how it's thinking through nuclear strategy and posture and doctrine and capabilities. And much in the same way the U.S. has had a more structured dialogue with Japan and also with South Korea in recent years about nuclear issues, which is, it's different because it's bilateral, but it's similar in the way that we have consultation mechanisms within NATO about nuclear issues. And I think that's one way that non-nuclear states can have a better understanding of these things and also some influence or some input into the decision-making of nuclear powers by having those relationships and being able to talk about these things, to be able to have their input into, say, policies or any decisions that may be made, and then also be able to better explain it to their own populations.
Eli Ratner wrote a very interesting piece for Foreign Affairs a couple of weeks ago in which he argued there should be a, not necessarily NATOization of Asia, but time to consider a formal defense pact between these countries. Is that something you think would ever fly in that region?
Well, it's certainly, it seems like it's a different region from when I was more focused on the Indo-Pacific earlier in my career, and also lived in Japan when I was in high school and my dad was in the Navy.
Just actually brief us on your career history very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, other than spending some time living in Japan when I was in high school, I did work at the Pacific Command back in the early 2000s, and I worked very closely with South Korea. I've worked with Australia in the past as well. I think it's really interesting to see how dynamic the politics in the region has changed, where there were a lot of bilateral alliances and there were some really difficult historical issues that kind of needed to be discussed and perhaps kind of overcome. And so now when you look at the region, nations are coming together and talking more, they're working more with each other, and I think they're a lot closer to each other than I've observed in a couple decades. Can they actually get to the point where there's some sort of like a defensive pact, not necessarily an alliance per se? I don't know. It remains to be seen. That's decisions that need to be made by the different nations that Eli was referring to there. If they want to do something like that, go for it. If it's in their interest, if it's how they can come together to show that there's political unity, of how their militaries perhaps can be interoperable with each other, if there's other areas of providing for security they want to cooperate in, say like cybersecurity as an example, and then they should pursue that. And if anybody questions why they're doing that, it's probably because it's driven by either threats or opportunities, or the fact that, again, it's politics. I mean, these are democratic nations. They have common values. They have common ways of trying to promote the rules-based international order. They're looking at ways to come together to be able to push back on some of these authoritarian regimes that have fundamentally different values, fundamentally different ways that they want to engage with other states, to include upending the rules-based international order, tearing up the UN Charter, as the Russians have done in their war against Ukraine. I mean, we want to preserve the status quo. We being me as an American coming from the United States, me as an American working in Brussels on behalf of 32 nations within NATO. I think a lot of people from many of these different nations were seeking to preserve the way the world is right now, and that is a world that is peaceful, that is prosperous, it can promote democracy and liberty, and we don't want to see nations going around and invading other nations and doing things that are causing great harm.
One of the lessons of Europe has been just how slow they were to build up their defences and spending. We're having a similar debate in the Indo-Pacific, and particularly in my home country of Australia. Spending is going to reach 2.3% of GDP by mid-next decade. It's obviously well below this new 3.5% target. Is it a word of advice to the region to look at Europe's experience and don't delay?
The big debate about defense spending and how much it should be, it's relatively important. It's important because it's an input, right? You need to be able to raise funding within your total budget. And if you allocate for that for defense, you have to have that, because we're not going to be able to get military capabilities for free. But the thing that we really count at NATO is we do look at defense spending, but it's really about how can you procure the military forces that you need. You're able to recruit the personnel to come into the military, and hence you've got fielded military capabilities. That's the key thing. So I would look at it as not necessarily how much money do we need to raise or to spend, but what do we think those capabilities are that we would need? What would a conflict look like? What would be the military forces we need to be able to achieve our objectives within that conflict? And when do we need them by? Work backwards from that date. If Australia needs X number of submarines by some point in time, that's what your target is. And then you do the math backwards to figure out.
I don't think anyone disputes the capability is the real crunch number, but we use these crude metrics to send the signal, right, that we're responding to the threat nature.
Yeah, and it definitely helps to do that. And I think to not only amplify the front end of that, the defense spending, which is what gets a lot of attention now, but it's also fielding those capabilities. So at NATO, one thing that I keep track of is F-35s. Because obviously we need them with our dual capable aircraft. We have a number of nations that are transitioning to that. And a number of nations are buying F-35s that will be conventional only. But approximately 600 F-35s across the alliance are on order right now. Well, as we transition from legacy aircraft to modern aircraft, we're getting even better in our defense because it's a highly capable platform. So you can keep track of maritime forces or whatever it may be. But we need to look at how are we continuing to transform our military forces to have that strategic advantage, that technological edge, and how fast do we need to do that? That's inherently unknowable, but everybody who works in a Ministry of Defense or a Defense Department like the way I have, you kind of keep track of these things to assess the relative power of the other side. And they do that to us as well. So as we field those capabilities, we exercise them, we talk about them, we show how capable they are. You use that for a deterrent effect because we know that the other side is going to be watching, and it's going to affect how they're thinking about a future conflict situation. And hence it raises the bar a little bit, it raises the threshold of maybe they're more capable than we thought they were. So defense spending is a part of that, but you have to think through all those things and how you can have an information component to those things and talking about it and showing what we're doing in exercises and demonstrations of our capability.
Jim Stokes, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me on today.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Bourke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.